So going to agree or disagree with these statements about Week 14 in the NFL. So Patrick Mahomes has had 15 fantasy points or less in 5 of his last 6 starts. Ooh. And yet, he is the top-priced option at quarterback on the slate for Week 14 as Kansas City hosts the Raiders. That's probably because his only great fantasy day over the last few weeks came against the Raiders.
Oh,
wow. He put up 39.24 fantasy points in Week 10. So what do you think? Are you chasing or fading Mahomes as a pay-up option here for Week 14, Steve?
No, not a pay-up option. Whoa. I mean, okay, so he did well in that game against the Raiders, okay? Congratulations. But if you look at over his past 6 games, he hasn't gone 2x on his salary in 5 of those 6 games. And in that game when he was facing the Raiders, he was $800 cheaper. Now, he had one of his best games of the season against this secondary, so I get it. You might want to do that there. But at the rate that he's been playing, he just hasn't been efficient enough to justify this salary. Like, he's hardly completing over 50% of his passes over that same span. So the matchup is fine. I get it. People are still going to pay up for Patrick Mahomes. But at $8,000, which is one of the highest he's seen all season long, with the way he's been performing, no thanks.
Are you passing that?
So I actually do think he deserves to be the most expensive quarterback, but I don't think it's worth paying up for it. And the problem is just the rest of the Chiefs are also so expensive. Part of what's happened recently is the Chiefs' defense has played well enough where Mahomes really has not needed to do that much. But if you want to stack Mahomes with Hill or Kelsey, it's just a lot more expensive than some other quarterbacks. So I think in a vacuum, Mahomes would be my bet for the most fantasy points, but it's easier to stack Josh Allen. It's easier to stack Tom Brady, and it's a lot easier to stack Justin Herbert this week, who's going to have a much cheaper group of players around him with Keenan Allen out of the lineup. So I think for stack choices, I'd rather just pick a different quarterback.
Dude, a lot of people could be looking to the Bucs here for a little stack because Leonard Fournette is known for his bruising running style. We just saw what the Patriots did against the Bills. But he's also turned into quite the pass catcher. At least 6 receptions in each of the last 4 games. Faces that Buffalo team. He only faced 3 pass attempts against the Patriots.
Just 3.
It's pretty safe to say Tampa Bay will probably air it out just a wee bit more on Sunday. So chase your fade for me here, Matt. Another big day in the passing game for Fournette.
This is a hard one. So I think there is a real trend where Fournette is a little more involved in the passing game. I think it is a little bit of a real thing. Like they've seen the results that they've been good from him over the last handful of weeks. And Giovanni Bernard has been a little less of a factor. Earlier in the season, he was kind of the passing down guy. Fournette, I think, has taken a little bit of that role. But I don't know that that makes him such a great DFS play despite that, because I think this is going on with a lot of running backs right now. And in the other cases, it's due to injuries. So we have Kenyon Drake is injured. Jalen Richard is injured on the Raiders too. So Josh Jacobs is taking on more of a passing role. Austin Eckler may take more of a pass catching role too with Keenan Allen out. And then we have Antonio Gibson with J.D. McKissic out. So I think a lot of running backs are moving in this direction where there's just for a bunch of different reasons, there's a lot of starting running backs who are becoming more of a receiving option too. Fournette is one of them, but I think there's a lot of guys like this. So he doesn't necessarily stand out from the group that way.
Hey, Steven, we're talking 28 passes he's caught on 31 targets in his past 4 games.
Yeah, it's wild. And in that span, he's seen at least 16% of the overall target share in 3 of those games, and then 23% or more in 2 of those games. Like, he's been a real option for Tom Brady in this offense. And now we're talking about a Buccaneers team that passes more than any other team in the league. And the Patriots kind of show that you can run against this team. We've seen 2 teams now that can run against this team or do whatever they want to do with running backs in this game. The other thing is, too, is that there's a lot of banged up running backs on this slate. Like, look at the top of the list here. Eckler, Kamara, Mixon, all coming in with a questionable tag, all dealing with injuries in this one. So I have no problem paying up for Leonard Fournette in this spot against the Buffalo Bills. I think this is going to be a lot of offense in this game. The Bills desperately need a win in this game, and the Buccaneers just continue to roll. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for Fournette in this game. I like him to continue that role as a primary passing down back.
All right, well, despite a 4-game winning streak for the Washington football team, Terry McLaurin has not been much of a factor in the offense. So he has just 1 game with 20-plus fantasy points over his last 5. But this week, Washington takes on a Dallas defense that has given up the 6th most passing yards in the NFL this season. So chase or fade, this is the week McLaurin breaks out, Steve.
Yeah, he's still a little too expensive for my liking, but the matchup bodes well for him going up against Trayvon Diggs. We've heard Diggs a lot during this season about how many interceptions that he's grabbed. He's been an absolute machine. He has 9 on the season. But when he's not grabbing interceptions and the opposing receiver he's facing is catching the ball, they're averaging 17.6 yards per reception. That is an absolutely absurd number for opposing receivers. And we know that obviously Terry McLaurin can stretch the field. He can get downfield with that. So I'm not crazy about the price, but this is probably one of the better individual matchups that he's had in weeks now. Back in week 11 against the Panthers, 24.3 DraftKings fantasy points in that game on 103 yards on just 5 catches. So that's just the type of player that he can do. Against Diggs specifically, he can have one of those games where he can really stretch the field against them. So I think it's a good spot for McLaurin. I don't know how crazy I am about paying up for him, but I think he's an option if you have the money.
Matt, is the matchup enticing enough for you to want to pay up?
So I think there's 2 ways to look at this. I actually don't necessarily think it's a good matchup. I think Dallas has given up a lot of passing yards. One, because they play in a dome for a lot of their games, and it's just easier to pass indoors. This game's going outside, so that changes things a bit. And then also, the Cowboys have had some games where they've had some huge leads, and quarterbacks have just racked up stats in garbage time. We had Sam Darnold in a game where the Panthers were down a bunch. Jalen Hurts did the same thing. We saw it last week. Taysom Hill basically got nothing going through the air until they were down a lot at the end. But there were also a lot of interceptions, and the Cowboys have been good at that. So to me, it's just like a high variance spot where McLaurin is definitely not safe. I could definitely see him having a really bad day. But like Steve said, I think there is potential for a big play here. So I think if you're playing in some big tournaments, McLaurin is worth a shot. But if I had to guess, he probably doesn't have a good game.
Well, this past week, too, guys, a lot of people were burned by very cheap options at tight end. Let's see. James O'Shaughnessy, Foster Moreau, they were both elevated in the starting role, so we are definitely looking at them, but we forgive O'Shaughnessy because he doesn't really have a head coach there in Jacksonville. So maybe it's time to pay up at the position. George Kittle here, Steven, had a monster game on Sunday against Seattle. He racked up more than 42 DraftKings fantasy points. He's 6,900 this week against the Bengals. I know it feels a little bit like some recency bias here, but chase or fade that it's worth chasing Kittle's high price after that huge game.
No, because I think the ownership is going to follow him there. I'm more than prepared to pay down at tight end again this week. I think there's some really good options down there, like Gerald Everett for the Seattle Seahawks. He's been getting so involved in that offense. I mean, he's seen 6 targets or more in 3 of his 4 last games. Evan Ingram's seen at least 5 targets in over his last 3 games. And then you have guys like Austin Hooper in a great matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, one of the worst teams in the league at defending against opposing tight ends. Even Nick Vanette's getting a little more looks now with the amount of injuries that the Saints have been dealing with. So there's a lot of guys in that mid 3,500 to 3K range that I think are extremely viable options. They're not going to get you 40 DraftKings fantasy points or anything like that, but they should be able to give you enough to pay back their salary, because there's going to be other positions I want to be paying up for. We talked about the quarterback position. We talked about guys like Leonard Fournette. So I think paying down at tight end is once again going to be the option this week.
Yeah, Maddie, I feel like, though, there's never anything wrong with like banking on one of the game's top tight ends, and I know how bad the Bengals are. Give up like second most fantasy points to them.
Yeah, I think the injuries are going to dictate a lot of what I think here. So part of what happened last week is Deebo Samuel didn't play against the Seahawks, and George Kittle has to take on a much larger role. I mean, we've seen Deebo this year basically do everything for the 49ers, whether it's being a running back or catching passes over the middle or catching the ball downfield. You take him out, and there's just much more to go around for everyone. So if Deebo is back this week, I think it's hard to expect Kittle to have anything close to the same level of production. But if Deebo's out again, even if Kittle's popular, I still think we can kind of expect him to continue to have a big role. I do think Deebo will play. So with that being the case, like, you probably just want to pick somebody else. Maybe Darren Waller comes back. He's a little cheaper. Or like Steve said, you just go down to a way cheaper tight end because there are some values. Maybe Jared Cook gets a little bit of an uptick in targets with Keenan Allen not playing. So I think there are a lot of options. But I do like Kittle if Deebo winds up not playing this week.
All right, finally, give us a storyline that you're chasing this week that could lead to a lot of fantasy points in Week 14. Something big picture here, Steve.
Yeah, look, I think Saquon Barkley is 100% healthy. Well, no one's 100% healthy. Let's say he's 90% healthy at this point. Now he gets one of the best matchups since he's returned here. They're still giving him a ton of looks on the ground, through the air. 9 targets last week against the Miami Dolphins in that 20-9 loss. The Chargers are not a good team against the run. They're not a good team at defending running backs who can catch out of the backfield. That's exactly what Saquon Barkley is. He's looked good over his past couple of games, whether it's through the air or on the ground. Averaged 5 yards per carry last week against the Dolphins on just 11 carries, but obviously the game script didn't allow them to run the ball. They will be able to run the ball this week against the Chargers, and with the number of injuries that they're dealing with, who's that quarterback this week? Jake Fromm? He's just going to be handing off the ball 50 times. Give me Saquon Barkley, 6K, too cheap for this matchup.
Matt, what storyline are you chasing in Week 14?
I've mentioned it a couple times already, but Keenan Allen being out due to COVID protocols, assuming that he doesn't make it back for this game, is a huge deal for fantasy implications for a lot of the Chargers receivers, for Jared Cook at tight end, but for Austin Eckler at running back. I think that the fact that he's the most expensive running back this week and that he also has a questionable tag is going to cause some people to shy away. But the injury status for him is that he's just kind of banged up. And that's true of just about everybody at this point in the season. I don't think there's anything especially wrong with Eckler that other guys aren't dealing with. And Keenan Allen not being there, who really is like the security blanket for this team, I think should result in Eckler having to do more. The Giants are also really bad against the run, and this should be a game where the Chargers have a lead. So I think this could be a week where Eckler, because of that price tag, because there are cheaper running backs who are going to be in enhanced roles with other injuries going on, I think Eckler could go a little overlooked, and we could see this be one of those monster games like he had a couple weeks ago against Pittsburgh.